3,200 gene expressions are changed by our thinking. What role do you believe this gene expression has with emotional regulation and preventing cognitive decline? Because right now it's an all-time high.
The number one risk factor for a buildup of amyloid and tau proteins in your brain was negative thinking. And it scaled. The more negative your thinking was, the greater the accumulation of these proteins. So much of our lives is dependent on our mental and emotional state, and it's completely under our control. We can decide to change our mindset, we can tap away our stress, we can learn to meditate, and you just have so much inner peace. You have love, you have joy. Don't compromise with thinking those negative thoughts. They literally are going to compromise your gene expression. We literally see the genes that code for these types of stress hormones and these malformed proteins being triggered by something like your mind, by your mindset, by your attitude.
Welcome to the Brain Fitness Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Patrick Porter. Please join us on our mission to better a billion brains. Enjoy the episode and remember to share it with your family and friends.
All right, welcome, Dr. Church, and we're going to call you Dawson today because you're just like me. I like to be known as Patrick. My dad was a doctor, so he was always Dr. Porter, and I was always Patrick in the clinic. So, Dawson, welcome to the Brain Fitness Podcast. We're so excited to have you here. You're a world leader, and I can't wait to get your insights.
It's going to be fun.
You have a book about the Bliss Brain, and a lot of people wonder what bliss is in the first place, but you're talking about cultivating peak states and remodeling our brains for happiness. And, a lot of people are wondering about that today. Back 20 years ago, they thought our brain was fixed, and you're writing books about how it changes. So can you explain how this process works and what practical steps can our brain fitness people use to achieve these peak states?
There's a lot you can do, and it's remarkable how much consciousness changes the brain. How we use the brain shapes the kind of brain we have. It shapes brain anatomy to a remarkable degree, and we've known about neural plasticity since the 1950s, the work of Marianne Diamond with rats showing that enriched environments produced a bigger hippocampus. We've known that now for 70 years. But what neuroscience is really starting to discover is the extent of brain changes. And in the realms of positive brain change, in my book, Bliss Brain, I looked at all the research on meditation, and I asked a number of questions, one of which is, what kinds of meditation produce the quickest neuroplastic change in the brain? And it turns out that there are three things that really move the needle. One of them is meditating in groups. One of them is meditating with intensity. And the number one thing that produces the most rapid brain remodeling is compassion. Studies of monks and nuns who have a compassion practice show that remodels the brain faster than anything else. The other thing that neuroscience is going to be really mapping in the next few decades is which brain regions change and by how much. And the initial research, Patrick, is astonishing about the how much part of the equation. And just one study published very recently was of Alzheimer's patients. And these are people with declining brains and shrinking brains. The brain shrinks by roughly 25% between the age of 60 and the age of 85. So it shrinks a lot, 25% major brain shrinkage as we age. The brains of Alzheimer's patients shrink around 70% post-mortem. If you take an Alzheimer's brain of, say, a 65-year-old and a normal brain, the Alzheimer's brain is basically this little tiny walnut rattling around in the skull. I mean, it's shocking brain shrinkage. And so in the study that people do a body-based meditation that was bringing in all these effective methods, and they compared it to patients who got a placebo. And they were expecting to see that the brain shrinkage in the meditation group would be less than that in the control group, and cognitive decline would be reduced as well. And they didn't find that at all. They found that cognitive decline was not reduced. They found that it was actually improved, and they found that brain shrinkage did not diminish a little less in the Alzheimer's group. The Alzheimer's brains grew. The prefrontal cortex grew, the memory and learning centers grew. And so what we're now showing is that as you use your brain, as you cultivate spiritual intelligence, as you meditate, as you are nice to people, compassion, you're actually doing fabulous things for the health of your brain.
Right. So it's not just good for your neighbor, it's good for you. I like that. And I mean, I know the studies show that when you do service, your brain actually improves and gets more neuroplasticity too. So it must fall right in line with what you're saying there. That's awesome. Now, you have so many books and so much to go to. I know we're not be able to get through even a tenth of it today, but in your book, Mind to Matter, you explore how the brain plays a critical role in constructing reality. And this might kind of push people to the boundaries because they don't really understand that we're constructing reality. How does this understanding impact our daily lives? And tell us some techniques we can use to harness this for better brain health and well-being.
Well, it sure pushed me to my limits because when I began writing Mind to Matter, I'd been having a number of dialogues with scientists about the link between our thoughts and things. So the idea is that thoughts become things. I mean, the Buddha told us this 2,500 years ago. Napoleon Hill, many other authorities have said that there's a link between our thinking and our manifestation of external reality. And what I expected to find when I began the book, and again, this is a rigorous hard science book, I thought I'd find in that chain of causation between thought and thing, I expected to find that there were some links we could prove scientifically, others where there were just gaps in the evidence record. What I found, to my amazement, as I actually delved deep into the science over several years, was that there are no broken links. We can show every link in the chain from thought to thing. And so we are remarkable creators of our own reality. Just two studies out of more than 400 in the book. One is research that I've done personally. I've done several clinical trials involving the cortisol molecule. And cortisol can be easily studied by researchers. It just needs a saliva swab. We can see what our cortisol is doing, whether it's going up, whether it's going down. And we find that when people are stressed, their cortisol goes up. This is no news to us. If we're, say, in a car crash, if you're in a fight with your spouse or a team member, you can have a big jump in cortisol, and then it's a master hormone that controls many downstream genes and other molecules. And so there's going to arise all of these other downstream effects as well when cortisol rises. And so we found that there was a big increase in cortisol when there was an actual stressor. What actually happens when you think about that stressor later on? You talked about the car crash, you talk about the fight with your team member. Your body can't tell the difference between your recap, your thinking about that event, and the event itself, and your body responds with a big rise in cortisol. If you have chronic stress, if you have traumatic stress, if you have PTSD, what we call the trauma loop, we find that you're producing cortisol in large amounts over and over and over again. When you intervene, when you do an effective technique like one of those meditations, when you use acupressure, we found acupressure is absolutely amazing. When you just tap or rub acupressure points on your body, there are about 13 of them that are highly potent. That, for example, when I worked with one veteran who'd been in Iraq, fought in the Battle of Fallujah, had 4 tours of duty there, when someone would do an innocuous move in his environment, like scream or shout, or he would hear a car backfiring, when he heard somebody crunching a plastic bottle, anything like that would send him into fight or flight. We did that acupressure intervention on him. Within 20 minutes, he could hear any of those stimuli and remain totally calm. As we've done this experimentally with people, we found that cortisol drops way, way, way down. So we can have a really big effect through our minds, through our consciousness, on our levels of cortisol. We're literally making molecules in our body with our thoughts. I mean, it's just amazing. We can make DHEA, we can make serotonin, we can make dopamine, we can make anandamide, beta endorphin, all the stuff with our minds. But the really cool studies in the second half of Mind to Matter are about how we make molecules and make change outside of our bodies. And it turns out to be absolutely remarkable that there is experimental evidence showing that the human mind and human consciousness can affect all 4 of the fundamental forces of physics: the strong nuclear force, the weak nuclear force, gravity, and electromagnetism. In one study, there was a guy, a healer, had a pager on, got a beep at random intervals, and sent healing energy to a group of mice, a cage of mice that had cancer. In a control group in a different lab in a different part of the university campus was a second group of mice, second cage of mice, not being sent healing. And so at random intervals, this one group of mice only got the healing energy. And they had a set of devices below the cage measuring the electromagnetism in that room. In that room, and in that room only, and at those random times they were being sent healing, and at those times only, the electromagnetism in that one place fluctuated up to 22%. This is human consciousness producing a remarkable effect on one of the four fundamental forces of physics. So our brains, our consciousness, our awareness is producing remarkable effects in the world around us. Another one is water. When we have intentions around the water we drink, the research shows that when water is held by a healer, held by a Qigong master, the molecular bond between the hydrogen and oxygen atoms actually changes. It's the only thing known to change that molecular bond. So we have this amazing ability with our minds to affect matter.
Yeah. When I grew up with my dad being a Silva instructor, Silva method. We used to teach people to change the structure of water by putting their hands on it and saying a prayer, and we could measure it. There was a device that my dad had that could, in the viscosity, people could tell the difference between a glass that hadn't been blessed and the glass that did. So pretty incredible stuff, back then we were considered kind of a little crazy, but now everybody's, with the NIH in 1994 saying, hey, we have a biosphere, that we have this energy field.
Right.
We're finding that there's a lot of people are now changing their tune. It's not what we call metaphysics anymore. It's actual science. So that's great. And I know I talked about when I was introducing you, you've helped 22,000 veterans. I want to thank you for that. That's great work in the trauma and PTSD areas. And with a method you call emotional freedom technique, or EFT. I know it's all over the world and people are using it everywhere, but tell me a little bit about how that helps with recovery. And is that what you're talking about with the pressure points?
Yes.
Using that technique?
Yeah, it's really cool. So we've done a lot of research. There are over 200 clinical trials of EFT, about 100 in English language peer-reviewed journals, about 100 in all kinds of other journals all over the world. And the ones that interest me the most are the ones that use physiological measures. And those are MRIs, EEGs. And what we see is a rapid shift in the EEG response. When people think about something that bothers them, they remember the car crash, they remember the bad thing that happened to them, they have an immediate lighting up of the brain's stress centers and of the emotion centers. The limbic system gets highly active on an EEG when you think about a past trauma. And so we have people wired EEGs, we have them thinking about these past traumas. We then have them, as they're focusing on the bad stuff in their lives, we have them tap or rub on these acupuncture points, just like I'm doing right now, just literally sticking your finger into an acupuncture point. And as you think about that, you're rubbing, you're stimulating this point. And what happens really rapidly is that limbic activation arousal just goes away. Now, 20 minutes later, they're telling you about the firefight in Fallujah. They're telling you about the terrible divorce. They're telling you about losing their house in the Great Recession. They're talking about the divorce. They're talking about the rape. They're talking about the mugging. And it's just a fact. They remember it, but it's no longer tagged by the brain as emotional. And this happens really, really quickly. And after we'd done enough research, we began to actually do this with veterans. And then eventually in 2017, we were approved by the VA as an evidence-based therapy. We're now training clinicians in the VA. We train people in Kaiser, in Cleveland Clinic, many others in primary care are now applying EFT, and it's almost miraculous for pain. Average drop in pain is about 65% in about 10 minutes of applying acupressure. Now, again, you might well need that prescription, but now it's a prescription for the remaining 1/3 of the pain, not for the 2/3 that was emotional and energetic. So that's a very quick summary of EFT, what it does and what it does in the body, how it shows up in the brain.
Yeah, I know they say that the issues are in the tissues, and we need to get rid of them. When I had my franchise company, we had 108 locations. Every one of them learned EFT because we used it for addictions, and then we would integrate it with BrainTap at the end. We didn't have BrainTap back then; it was another piece of equipment that I developed. But it was the meditations and mindfulness that we do. And you talk a lot about that science, and you have one you call eco meditation. So tell me how that differs from traditional meditation practices, and maybe where they can find more about that.
Yeah, and I developed eco meditation in 2009 because I've been meditating on and off. I had been since I was a teenager, and I tried to escape my own anxiety and depression and suicidality by learning meditation, joining a spiritual community, learning the great perennial philosophy of the world's traditions. And so I wanted to learn these things and try and get a little less unhappy than I was back then. And I learned it, but I always found it difficult. And people try and meditate, but of course, when you close your eyes, your mind fills with all kinds of random thoughts, and that's the perennial difficulty of the meditator's mind wandering. And what I began to realize after 2000 was that if you use evidence-based techniques and B, physiological ones, that you can regulate that mind wandering and regulate your physiology really easily. So I just stacked heart math, the heart coherence technique, on top of EFT tapping, on top of mindfulness, on top of self-hypnosis, on top of neurofeedback, and you just do some simple physiological regulation this way. And what we find is 9 out of 10 people drop right away into a deep state. We did an MRI clinical trial of eco meditation, and we had a control group, had an experimental group, and the experimental group was people who weren't meditators for the most part. They were just people volunteering for a study at a university. And we then had them do a 22-minute meditation track, again, doing physiological regulation. That's the key here. Not mental, not trying to do anything spiritual or with your mind, just regulating your physiology for those 22 minutes a day. And we measured their brain function, structure and function, before and afterwards with high resolution MRIs. And when the results came back from the lab of the composite of those people after a month, the results show the same kinds of changes as we see in Tibetan monks with 10,000 hours of meditation practice. It was stunning. Their part of the brain, the mid-prefrontal cortex, that handles self-focus, narcissism, worry about myself, the past, the future, who I am, identity, that part of the brain that's highly active in depressed people, anxious people, was calm. And the part of the brain that handles prosocial emotions, the insula, which is all about compassion, altruism, gratitude, awe, all of these other positive emotions, was lit up like a Christmas tree, not just while they were meditating, when they weren't meditating. So it's producing structural and functional changes in the brain in a month. That's why I say that the future of neuroscience is discovering how quickly we can literally change our brains. And the implications of this are stunning. We're the only species that can just change our brain in a month in remarkable ways. And we do it through this calming and centering process. But again, it's physiological regulation. It has nothing to do with spirituality or trying to use our minds. It's just getting our body regulated.
Yeah, that's great. I know that you have a background in psychology and integrative health, but you use the term energy psychology. And brain tappers know I talk about we live in an energy economy. So I was very interested when I was reading that about what you talk about, because you talk about energy and psychology. A lot of people don't think those two go together. So explain to me what energy psychology is.
Yeah, it's a great term, and it's evocative as well. And in the acupuncture theory posits that we have 14 meridians that run through our bodies, and that if there's a blockage in one of those meridians, that will become unhealthy. Our organs might be compromised and our health might suffer. And so in acupuncture, we insert needles into those points. In acupressure, we tap or rub on them and we release those blockages. And it's just amazing to see how quickly, as you shift energy, the mind changes and the body changes. So it's purely an energy adjustment. And there are other forms of energy psychology as well. Some use breathing, some use other energy structures like the chakras, some use various components of heart rate regulation, and all of them have in common a focus on the energy system. And when you change the energy of the body, when the body just energetically is relaxed, when it's flowing, when it's in this flow state, it shows up on the brain. We can hook people up to an EEG. We see right away when they're moving into those meditative flow states, either in waking life, we call it flow. That's what flow is basically meditation with eyes open in daily life. Meditation is what you do at the beginning of every day when you're tuning into the all that is, into that reality greater, that consciousness greater than your own local consciousness. And so energy psychology recruits energy and has people shift. Now, it's not a standalone method in that you might, again, still need a prescription. You might still need an operation. You're definitely going to need clean water, great food, appropriate nutrition, appropriate supplementation. It's not as though you can use energy. Like we find people take our EFT classes and they get wildly enthusiastic about energy psychology. They see these miraculous cures. Like last week, I was on the phone with a group and one woman said, Dawson, I'm so grateful to you and to EFT. I had fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue, all these symptoms for 46 years. I learned to tap, and now I don't. 46 years of fibromyalgia, and she was just dazzled by how quickly that her fibromyalgia symptoms disappeared as she learned to regulate her energy. And one of the problems with this is we have to train people and say, hey, okay, you're enthusiastic, I get it. Make sure you're checking with your doctor before you stop using your prescriptions. Make sure you're still getting exercise. Make sure you're not thinking that energy is this thing that's going to substitute for every other part of your health. You want to have a multifaceted approach to your well-being. But the first thing you can do if you're in a jam, correct your energy around money, around relationships, around any disease you have, a diagnosis, and then see what's left that's really organic or medical or in the realm of external reality about this. If you're in a bad relationship, correct your energy, but maybe there's abuse going on there that you have to address. So you don't want to substitute energy for other parts of a healthy life.
Sure. Out there in the world today, they're saying we have a mental health problem. Personally, I think we have a sedentary problem. People aren't moving, and so their energy isn't flowing, and they lack of breath, and there's a lot of different reasons for that. But you have a technology that can help that. How do you see that working in the health field as far as like anxiety and depression? What do you see is happening there?
Our ratios of anxiety and depression are up dramatically. According to the WHO, referrals to psychiatrists have doubled since 2020, and mental health providers are really struggling under this huge burden. And the research on EFT is amazing. So in meta-analyses, the standard that's used is a scale to determine how effective a therapy is. And if you have a number of 2 on a meta-analysis, that means your therapy is making an effect. 5 is a good effect, and 8 is a big effect. So the scale from 2 to 8 with 5 in the middle means that you can measure the effectiveness, the treatment effect of a therapy on that 2, 5, and 8 scale. The number for EFT for anxiety on that 2, 5, and 8 scale is 12. For depression is 13. For PTSD is 18. It's way off the charts in terms of our treatment methods. So we have these incredibly effective methods. And we find that people come in with anxiety and depression and PTSD. PTSD is treatable. There are clinical guidelines published by the Kaiser Permanente Journal for treating people with PTSD with EFT, and they specify 10 one-hour treatment sessions. And often people respond in 3 or 4. So all of these mental health issues have so sapped human potential for so many centuries, millennia, forever, now are fairly easily treatable. Not, 100 sessions or 10,000 hours. Right. 10 sessions, and you're usually substantially free of the worst of that burden. Now, I also want to just, again, throw in my caveat here. That doesn't mean it's going to solve every problem in your life. We did one study with healthcare workers, 216 doctors and nurses and therapists and other healthcare workers, doing a one-day EFT workshop with me. And after the workshop, their anxiety, depression had dropped by 45%. A massive drop in anxiety and depression from one day of tapping. But does that mean it'll drop by another 45% in the second day? Unfortunately not. But again, the low-hanging fruit is there. And if we could reduce the burden to our society of anxiety and depression by 45% with a simple method, that would liberate human potential in a huge way. So there are two parts of the equation. The tapping is great for reducing stress. That's what tapping's for. It does it very quickly. EFT takes about 2 minutes to do. You want to also throw in meditation. And meditation is to build resilience. In my book, Bliss Brain, the subtitle is all about building creativity, resilience, and joy. It does all three of those things. 6 years ago, my house was destroyed in a wildfire in Northern California. And literally, my wife woke me up in the middle of the night and 12:45 a.m. shook me awake. I ran outside and there was a wildfire sweeping down the valley toward our home. We literally ran to our car and escaped with our lives as the trees were bursting into flames around us. And dozens of people died. 5,000 homes were destroyed that night. It was just one of these everything. We lost everything. We just lost absolutely all our possessions. And we had another couple of years of just disastrous losses in our lives. Through it all, I was meditating every day. And, it wasn't easy, but I had built resilience over decades of meditation. And I was able to sit in that place. And in the year after the fire, I wrote the book Bliss Brain. I wrote about anandamide, the neurochemical that makes us feel incredibly ecstatic in meditation. Serotonin, dopamine, beta endorphin, all these wonderful pleasure-inducing neurotransmitters, they're all there in our brains when we meditate. And that's how I was able to feel good and be resilient, even in the face of huge losses. So you want to build that resilience every day, as well as having EFT to get you back into shape when you're facing an immediate crisis.
Right. That's awesome. Now, one of the hot topics that's out there when I go out and lecture around the world is genes. And you've done a lot of research and expressing and influenced by how genes influence emotions in your book, The Genie in Your Genes, which I think is an awesome title. That's a great title. What role do you believe this gene expression has with emotional regulation and preventing cognitive decline? Because right now it's an all-time high, right? We have a 35-year-old that I just heard about that got dementia. And I'm going, I never heard about it when I was growing up. We had one person in my neighborhood that was a super old person that was kind of maybe had a little bit of decline, but it wasn't to the scale we're seeing now in masses. So tell us a little bit about how genes play a role in this.
Yeah, so the primary gene in Alzheimer's disease is called the ApoGene, APOE gene, and it regulates cholesterol and several other transporter molecules. If people get an ApoGene variant 4 from their mother and their father, both parents have an ApoGene 4/4, and when I was learning about the ApoGenes in the 70s and 80s, the idea was that produced about a 92% likelihood of Alzheimer's. If you had an apogene 4 from one parent and apogene 3 from the other parent, then you had about a 75% chance of Alzheimer's. So these were considered highly genetically determined diseases. Apogene 1 and 2 aren't a problem for Alzheimer's dementia. So we've had this model of genetic determinism for so much of science in the last century, and yet the newer studies are showing that when you are meditating, when you are exercising, when you are having healthy social connections, that your risk for Alzheimer's drops dramatically, even if you're an Alzheimer's apogene 4/4 variant, you still have a much lower chance of getting it. One study of beta amyloid and tau plaques accumulating in the brain, and we can now measure these non-intrusively. So we can very easily measure these just with a scan. And it found that people had a higher buildup of beta amyloid and tau plaques, which are associated with Alzheimer's disease in their brains. And the factor that was greater than lifestyle, smoking, eating, obesity, diabetes, apogene, anything, was negative thinking. The number one risk factor for a buildup of amyloid and tau proteins in your brain was negative thinking. And it scaled. The more negative your thinking was, the greater the accumulation of these proteins. So much of our lives is dependent on our mental and emotional state, and it's completely under our control. We can decide to change our mindset. We can tap away our stress. We can learn to meditate, and you just to have so much inner peace. You have love. You have joy. I have a whole bunch of words on the board behind me, which an artist did for me, of all these positive values, and bring those things into your life. Don't compromise with thinking those negative thoughts. They literally are going to compromise your gene expression. We literally see the genes that code for these types of stress hormones and these malformed proteins being triggered by something like your mind, by your mindset, by your attitude. So you really want to be triggering positive gene expression. And you do that, again, meditation is fabulous. Time in nature is also really important. Social connections are powerful. And in Mind to Matter, I list about 30 things you can do that by themselves will trigger positive gene expression. And then again, that's going to dramatically reduce your chance of dementia, even if you have this strongly encoded genetic combination. So yeah, there are those genes, and they are highly susceptible to our inner life and our consciousness.
Yeah, I love that book in the 80s. It was You Can't Afford the Luxury of a Negative Thought. That was a really good book. With Bruce Lipton saying that 3,200 gene expressions are changed by our thinking. I mean, and so you're showing that. Now, when you work with the vets, I mean, in PTSD, that's a big lift. I mean, that's some real heavy trauma. How can you relate that to the everyday person? Because I think through 2020, everybody had a little PTSD there just by the stress of having to stay in the house, not do their everyday thing. And still people look at other people like there's some kind of disease instead of looking at them as individuals. You know, they're scared of them. I'm still amazed that I walk through the airport and some people still have masks on and things like that. You know, it's like, but that's their choice, I guess. But there's a study that was done that when people looked at life as a threat, they actually produced 200 times less light because every cell is emitting, 8-10 nanometer light. So when they emit less light, that means they're not getting the right information to the cells to make those gene expression changes. What would you say, and how would you apply your technology to help this population that has this general anxiety that they might think is normal now?
Yeah, and so people with PTSD have this looping trauma, and they have what are called intrusive thoughts. Intrusive thoughts are ones you can't control. But a big study by 2 Harvard psychologists found that for normal people who haven't been traumatized, almost 1/2 of their thoughts are intrusive and negative. So we're having these even if we aren't traumatized. I mean, if we haven't been in combat or been in a childhood situation that was a lot like combat. And so how do we counteract this? Well, my recommendation is to do it proactively. So you can certainly do it reactively, and we recommend people tap whenever they're stressed, meditate, have time in nature, breathe, do all of these things. But we recommend that they do it proactively. So do it before you need it. The reason I could have my house burned down and have all these big losses and still be roughly on an even keel. Now, again, life wasn't easy for the next 2 years. But again, I had this inner resilience. It's because I had built that over time. So you want to build that up in advance of these kinds of issues. The second thing is that, Patrick, the world is full of wonder and beauty and awe. I took a bike ride through my neighborhood. I bicycle twice a day, and I took a bike ride, and I was going through a neighborhood I've lived in for many, many years. And I just looked at the flowers. There's a flower called the crepe myrtle that's blooming now. It's just so beautiful, big pink flowers on top of the trees. And I just relished those crepe myrtle flowers. And I looked at some of the small flowers growing on the ground. And you just train yourself after a while to really enjoy what's there. When you are in this space in meditation of connecting with the all that is, when you're letting go of your little petty human ego, your small I, the small consciousness, and you're becoming one, you're breathing, and you're becoming one with the great consciousness, the all that is, it produces enormous joy, and it shifts your whole perspective. If you do that in the morning, you then move into the world, and you feel far more confident, you feel far more open. And what it is doing in terms of COVID and in terms of immunity is it is dramatically upregulating your immune system. We did one study of a week-long retreat and these participants were doing meditation in the morning and they were tapping during the day. And this was a retreat where they were really working on childhood trauma. So we were bringing up all kinds of childhood memories intensively in this group for like 8 hours a day. And so again, intensive meditation, intensive tapping. And we measured cortisol and also immunoglobulins before and after. Immunoglobulins are these little tiny Y-shaped molecules that bind with the spikes on COVID and neutralize them. And we found that between day one and the end of the week, that their cortisol dropped by 37%. So a massive drop in their stress biochemistry. At the same time, that frees up all kinds of biological resources for immunity, for fighting inflammation, for fighting cancer. All kinds of beneficial things happen when you drop that stress response. Their immunoglobulins, those Y-shaped molecules that bind to COVID, those rose 113% over the course of the week. All these results were statistically significant. Their heart rate reduced, their blood pressure went down, all kinds of physiological measures improved. So the best thing you can do for yourself is to use these tools, use them proactively before you need them. That way, when you're challenged, you have a stronger immune system, you have much less stress molecules going on, and then fast forward to the end of your life. And maybe you're only 30 or 40 right now. And like that study you mentioned, or that person you mentioned that had early onset dementia, the brain signatures of dementia show up in the brain 30 years before they show up as symptoms in the body. So Uncle Harry's forgetting things at 65. If he had a brain scan at 35, those adverse changes are showing up in his brain then. So you want to start this kind of routine early in your life. Don't wait till you're Uncle Harry at 65. I mean, you can definitely repair your brain then, but start right now. So you want to do these things early and proactively. And it shows that we really can affect our levels of anxiety and depression, other mood factors, and move to the end of your life. And these huge epidemiological studies showing that optimists live, on average, 10 years longer than pessimists. 10 years longer to travel the world, play with your grandkids, paint whatever you're planning to do in the last 10 years of your life. You get 10 more years of life if cumulatively throughout your life you've taken care of your internal wellness. So you really want to put these things into practice right now, whatever your age, and not wait until you're, maybe suffering decline later on in your life and try and remedy it then.
I know at BrainTap Nation, we have 120,000 users, and every month we look at what sessions are number one listened to, and 1 through 10, and it amazes us. We have 3 sessions about removing negativity, and those are the top ones. But if you talk to people, they'll never tell you that. But in the privacy of their own home, they know that they need to change that negative thinking because they don't feel good. Negative thinking makes you feel sick. It's a low energy frequency, right? And one of the things you talk about in the mind-body connection and all of this in brain health is physical exercise. I actually tell people it's the number 2 thing. Number 1 is you can't outthink a bad diet. And then number 3 is some kind of brain fitness. You need to do all 3 of those, and you don't have to have a breakdown to have a breakthrough. So many people are waiting until they're 65, like you're saying. Start doing something early. I mean, if you're hearing this message right now, Dawson is teaching you, throwing down some wisdom here that you can do this every day, and it doesn't take a lot of time. I mean, it's not like you have to invest in a PhD program to improve your brain. You can spend, you can spend a little bit of time here and there, right? So tell me a little bit about what you found with physical exercise, movement, enhancing brain function, and neuroplasticity.
Wilhelm Reich, a century ago, brilliant psychiatrist, coined the term body armor. And I think that term is so evocative. And he found that people armor their bodies. If you look at old people, very often they're hunched and they're withdrawing their chest and they're hunching their shoulders forward. They're defending their heart, and then their spine is bent. They may develop osteopenia, osteoarthritis. So All of those things are a sequel. Notice where your body armored right now, a sequel to those thoughts, those anxieties you've had, where you're pulling back from life. We're meant to walk with a straight spine, erect posture, open chest, open to the world, sharing our gifts, sharing our potential with those around us. Where are you pulling back? And notice that about yourself. Where are you body armored? And is energy not flowing? We'll find too, Patrick, when people, like one woman was talking to me about a car crash at one of my live workshops, and this car crash had a huge impact on her life. She'd been injured, and she'd never begun to get over it psychologically. And she told the story, and her shoulders were hunched. She was rigid. She was her legs were stiff. After tapping and using EFT on the story, she told the story of the car crash a second time, but now she's moving around. She has full range of motion in her shoulders and neck, and she's able to tell the same story without the body armor. So your body armoring is a pretty good guide to where you are armoring yourself against life. And you want to find the way of living joyfully. I have a lot of grandchildren, enough to form my own village right now. And I just love seeing them when they're 3 months old and 5 years old and 15 years old. I mean, they are just full of life and joy and spontaneity and self-expression. And babies, toddlers laugh an average of 300 times a day. Adults laugh an average of 20 times a day. 94% of our laughter is shut down, somewhere between the age of 4 and the age of 20. And it doesn't have to be that way. You want to laugh, you want to find the fun and joy there is in every situation. There's always beauty, there's always kindness. You just walk down the street, you look for the kindness, you look for the goodness in other people, look for the good in the world. There is so much good going on. Like during COVID, I was so touched when Canadians coined a new word, and there was all this fear-mongering going around, about the vaccine conspiracy theories and anti-vaccine and all this. I mean, huge amounts of fear, the unknown. And in Canada, this word was coined called caremongering, taking care of other people, with Canadians making sure that the elderly and the infirm in their communities had food and medical attention and company. And so we can become caremongers. We can become these radiant lights. We find in our research on meditation that people initially have that dawning inner light. You mentioned that study showing the emission of biophotons, the light that flows from our body. Initially, it's inside you. After a while, once you get happy enough, meditation enough, you'll find that that light just radiates around you. And then you are this light bulb of a person walking down the street, and people light up all around you because you're just so ecstatic and have such wonderful energy around you. So it's just beautiful to be in a community of people like that. When you're in a community of people like that, you'll find you attract others like you, and suddenly everything starts to change around you. So we live in this world of beauty and potential and awe and kindness, and it doesn't take much to find it. Once we sensitize ourselves to it, that becomes the world we live in. Big data shows that about a quarter of the people in the world are living in despair. About a quarter are living in ecstasy, and the other half are somewhere in between. We all live in the same world with the same news headlines, the same challenges. How come a quarter are in despair and a quarter are in ecstasy? You may as well join the top quarter.
Yeah, might as well feel good. That's great. Now, I know you've been a part of a lot of special issues and top-rated journals. You're really a well sought after in your neuroscience information and education. Where do you think brain health research is going, and what's exciting you the most about the future of this kind of industry?
Yeah, that's a great question, Patrick. And where I think brain research is going to go is we're going to keep on being astonished at the speed of change. So in that study, like in my book, Bliss Brain, I have one image from a scanning electron microscope of two neurons that are firing together, and they're like shaking as they fire, and then they get closer and closer and closer to each other, and then they wire together. They actually join and link, and the whole process takes 12 seconds. 12 seconds, we formed a new neural pathway. People have no idea, even neuroscientists fail to appreciate the importance and the speed of neural plasticity. Another case history in the book shows the emotion regulation circuit after meditation growing by a quarter 25% in 2 months. So we can rapidly remodel our brains. And I think that studies of how we remodel our brains, which parts of our brains we remodel, are going to become really important in the next while. And they're going to show that we are remodeling our brains much quicker and much more extensively, and that many more people are remodeling their brains than in the past. In a new book I'm writing called Spiritual Intelligence, I'm looking at this and seeing how this is affecting society. And one of the factors is that in 1980, about 1% of the population in developed countries was meditating. According to the CDC in the US, it's now hitting 20%. There's been a 20-fold rise in meditators changing their brains, changing the insula, changing the orbitofrontal cortex, the attention circuit, changing the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, the emotion regulation circuit. We're changing these circuits en masse, millions of people all over the world, and that's producing a more compassionate, wiser society. Another astonishing finding, very, very newly published study, which I'm talking about in Spiritual Intelligence in the new book, is that our brains are growing. Our brains as human beings, the human brain is getting bigger. People's brains are actually getting larger. This is very, very new research, not very well known at all yet. It'll become better known. And we'll be developing in the next while protocols to grow really important parts of our brains and even more importantly, shrink others. In that Alzheimer's study showing that Alzheimer's patients who were meditating with these physiological methods grew their prefrontal cortex and their hippocampus, 2 parts of the brain shrank. The amygdala shrank. And you don't need a big amygdala if you aren't a fearful person. So in long-term meditators, that part of the brain starts to shrink. And the second part of the brain that shrank in those Alzheimer's patients was the nucleus accumbens, which has to do with craving. And craving for alcohol, cigarettes, fentanyl, OxyContin, drugs, heroin, chocolate. That part of the brain just gets smaller. Does that mean you will never want a chocolate again? You may want a chocolate every once in a while. You probably won't be addicted to fentanyl. So you want to have these changes happen in your brain, and you can do it just with practices like tapping, like meditation. And so that's why I just know that's going to be a big focus of research in the next few decades.
That's great. Now, if you liked what you've heard from Dawson Church, go to dawsonchurch.com because you can download the Zen Master Brainwaves. It's right on the front page. You can get it there. He's got links to all of his information, links to other podcasts. You're a wealth of information. I know I could keep asking you questions. You could keep talking probably for weeks. So this has been very enlightening. We're going to put in the show notes all of the different social media channels. You're very prolific out there doing things. You're speaking all the time on people's podcasts. We'll have links to your books so people can get those and just learn more because you've been out there researching. You're one of the forerunners of doing this. I know that EFT has been around a long time. I've been following it forever and had myself and my therapist learn it because we felt like it's a good interrupt pattern and then install a new pattern. And, the nervous system needs that every once in a while. We need to shake it up a little bit to get it out of its own self, get it out of its ways. But as we wrap up today, what would be your parting thought for BrainTap Nation, and maybe give them some tips on what would be next steps? If they were your best friend and they needed some help, what would you tell them to do next? What would be the next thing for them to go out and learn about you, learn about your techniques? What would you invest in, have them invest their time in?
There's a concept in medicine called the minimum effective dose. You don't need necessarily a lot of something for it to be effective. You want to take 2 aspirins, call me in the morning. They'll take away your headache. Does that mean 20 aspirins is better? No. Take 2 aspirins. So what's the minimum thing you need to do? The minimum you want to do is make the commitment to meditating every day. And again, that eco-meditation track which you download is 20 minutes long. And that's a minimal dose. That is alone enough to produce an effect. We've just finished a study being published in a peer-reviewed journal shortly that measures productivity. People who do that for 30 days have a 20% increase in productivity. They get an extra day a week. So it's going to improve your productivity. So download that meditation track, the eco-meditation track, and use it. Do that one thing. When you get upset, download our free mini manual, on EFT Universe, download the tapping manual, go to the back page, look at tapping on a page. Whenever you're stressed, just tap. Do those two things. What you want to do beyond that is just look at your lifestyle. What can you do? You've now got two really quick things that are the minimum effective dose. But can you take time in nature? Now, maybe you can't go on a week-long retreat in a forest ashram, but maybe you can go stand in a park barefoot for a couple of hours and lay down under a tree and read a book. Research shows that even in an urban landscape, time in nature like that produces the same epigenetic changes, positive ones, that time in a forest does. So expose yourself to nature. Be kind to others. EFT will help you tap away your anger, frustration, guilt, blame, shame, all the other negative emotions. Find kindness in your heart. And with my wife, whenever I'm speaking to her, I take care to drop into my heart. I'm a person who gets super into my head, and she's a person who's basically living in her heart and her body all the time, and it's just beautiful to see the way that's just the way she is. So I make sure I meet her where she is. When I talk to my children, when I'm with an animal, when I'm with a stranger, I make sure I drop into my heart. How can you be compassionate? Find out who triggers you. Maybe the people making war right now trigger you. They certainly trigger me. The people who are being nasty and harsh to other people, who are being critical, who are causing division. That is a big trigger for many of us. And we can use that triggering and move into compassion. Picture that person who is doing those violent things to others. I can assure you that person is in hell. That person is suffering worse than you could possibly imagine. They deserve our compassion, even though their actions might be leading to the deaths and injury of other people. So it's hard to have compassion on these people, and we can try. I know I'm challenging you on that one, but again, living from compassion, living from the heart is a game changer. So there are lots of these techniques in my books. Just grab these things, do what you can, at least meditation and tapping. If you can do time in nature, then go do that as well. But work into your lifestyle practical things that'll change the game for you. Remember that study, the optimists and pessimists, you get an extra 10 years as a consequence, and they're way happier years than you otherwise would have.
That's awesome. And I appreciate you, Dawson, coming out, sharing with BrainTap Nation. I know you're a busy man, helping all these people, writing your books and doing your research. So appreciate that. And those of you listening, please like and share this video. Share it with your family and friends. These are simple things that you can begin to do that have profound effects. Like he's talking about the minimum dose that you need. And most people don't realize it's just a little intervention here and there will make a massive change in your health and your life of your brain. Again, thank you for being a part of the Brain Fitness Podcast. We're about to better a billion brains. It all starts with your thoughts and ends up as the things around you. And if you don't like the things you're seeing around you, go back to the source, start changing it from inside out, and have the best life now. So thank you again for being a guest. Thank you for being a listener. And please share this out with the world.
Thank you for joining us on our mission to better a billion brains. Follow at Dr. Patrick Porter on social media for updates, and remember to practice brain fitness every day.